Humanity has violated our trade laws for the last time. The trade overseer's voice cut through the air like a blade, reverberating across the grand vault. The golden sphere of commerce, the very seat of the Galactic Trade Federation's power, had never known disorder. Until today. Delegates from 100 worlds shifted in their seats, some exchanging cautious glances, others reveling in Earth's impending downfall. The chamber's crystal architecture shimmered, reflecting the anxious energy rippling through the gathered merchants, bankers, and corporate titans. At the center of the storm, James Walker, Earth's trade ambassador, stood alone. His hands were tucked into his pockets, his suit slightly creased from the shuttle ride, but his posture was unshaken. His round glasses caught the light as he tilted his head slightly, utterly unfazed by the words ringing through the chamber. The laser plasma displays overhead pulsed with data, graphs, projections, a visual prophecy of Earth's economic collapse. The Federation's finest analysts had spent months crafting these numbers, convinced that their sanctions would reduce humanity to begging within weeks. Walker adjusted his glasses with one hand, his movements unhurried. Then finally he spoke. "Are we done?" The chamber froze. The overseer's scales darkened, his upper arms twitching with restrained fury. "You mock this ruling, human," he hissed. "Do you not understand? The Federation's embargo begins immediately. No trade, no commerce, no resources. Your economy will crumble without our markets." Walker exhaled softly, then checked his wristwatch. "Right. Okay." He nodded, tapping the glass as if timing something. The overseer's pupils contracted. "You have nothing to say?" Walker gave a small shrug. "Just wondering how long it'd take." "How long for what?" the overseer demanded, his voice tight with suspicion. Walker slid his phone from his pocket, tapped the screen a few times, and held it up. "For this." The laser plasma displays behind him flickered, the Federation's embargo map glitching as new economic reports flooded in. Earth's stock markets, unaffected. Supply chains, stable. Galactic resource exports, still moving. The murmurs in the chamber shifted, no longer triumphant, but confused. Walker snapped his phone shut. "That was your move?" He turned slightly, gazing at the gathered aliens, his expression mildly amused. "That was supposed to break us?" The chamber erupted. A tentacled merchant slammed his appendage against the desk, his species equivalent of a gasp of horror. A hive-clustered delegate clicked his mandibles, antennae twitching with unease. Even the cold-blooded financiers who had been grinning moments before now exchanged worried glances. The overseer's throat tightened. Impossible. Earth should have collapsed immediately. "You're bluffing!" he spat. "Your people are cut off. You have no supply lines." Walker waved a hand. Sure. File that in triplicate." Then he turned toward the exit. A thick, choking silence followed him. The crystal doors hissed shut behind him. A holographic newscaster flickered across the screens in Times Square, her voice smooth, unconcerned. "In breaking news, the Galactic Trade Federation has officially cut all trade with Earth." A beat of silence. Then she smiled, unreadable. "And now in sports, the Yankees take a surprising lead." The streets were alive, unaffected by the supposed catastrophe. Civilians continued shopping, restaurants buzzed with conversation, and in the sky above, civilian freighters drifted on schedule, their routes unchanged. Inside the United Nations Trade Office, a meeting unfolded with all the urgency of a Monday morning briefing. "The embargo is confirmed," an aide noted, glancing at the laser plasma display. The trade secretary stirred her coffee. "Huh." Walker's face appeared on the conference screen, mid-bite into a sandwich aboard his shuttle. "They actually did it?" she asked, barely looking up. "Yep," Walker replied, brushing crumbs off his tie. "Figured I'd let you know." She sighed. I'll put it on next week's agenda. Far from Earth, the first signs of confusion rippled through the Federation's supply chains. A patrol ship intercepted a freighter labeled Terra Unlimited, its alien captain sneering as he activated the comms. "You are in direct violation of the embargo. Cease operations at once." A cheerful, automated response followed. "Thank you for contacting Terra Unlimited. Your message is important to us. Please hold." The soft chime of hold music played through the Federation's most advanced warship. The alien captain hesitated, his command officers blinking at their monitors. The ship's ID was registered through a neutral colony. The Federation's systems had no authority over it. "This," the captain's voice wavered. "This isn't possible." Yet the freighter continued on its way, untouched. Back inside the Grand Vault, the Overseer glared at the reports flooding across his heads-up display. His breath hitched. Projected losses? Minimal. Earth's GDP? Stable. Federation suppliers? Suffering. The embargo was collapsing before it had even begun. The laser plasma display flickered again. A new report. A Federation-controlled mining colony had just outbid its own suppliers to purchase Earth-mined materials through a third-party neutral broker. The Overseer's blood ran cold. This wasn't desperation. This was preparedness. Walker had known this would happen. And worst of all, he hadn't even cared. The Grand Vault's main laser plasma display glowed with fresh reports, its shifting data casting a fractured light across the chamber. The Trade Overseer sat rigid in his throne-like seat, his clawed hands gripping the armrests tighter than necessary. The silence was unnatural. His aides dared not speak. On screen, new financial projections filled the air. The embargo had been in place for a full rotation. Earth's economy was supposed to be collapsing by now. Instead, the Federation's own markets were faltering. The Overseer's lower left hand twitched, his breathing sharp as he scanned the numbers. Supply chains were constricting, but not for Earth. No riots, no famine, no desperate requests for mercy. Instead, the chaos was brewing within their own trade networks. Another notification blinked across the screen. A new black market brokerage had emerged overnight, rerouting raw materials from unregistered freighters. Earth's industrial output was somehow rising, despite the sanctions. The Overseer's gaze hardened. "Where is the collapse?" he muttered, his voice a low hiss. His chief analyst, a hunched, four-eyed amphibian, hesitated before speaking. There is none, Overseer." The words felt foreign, like a miscalculation spoken aloud. The assembled council members stirred, exchanging wary glances. They had expected desperation, not indifference. A holographic seal flashed on the main screen. An official transmission from Earth. The Overseer straightened. "Play it," he ordered. The display shifted, revealing James Walker, seated comfortably in a UN trade office, one arm casually resting on the table. His tie was slightly loosened, a cup of coffee within reach. Behind him, through the window, the lights of Earth's cities burned bright, unfazed, uninterrupted. "Good morning, gentlemen," Walker greeted, adjusting his glasses. "I see the embargo is going about as well as expected." The Overseer's throat tightened. Walker gestured lazily toward the charts visible in the display behind him. "Just wanted to check in. See how you're holding up." The chamber erupted. Federation delegates shouted over one another, voices clashing in a chaotic storm of disbelief. Walker leaned forward slightly, as if he were listening to a mildly amusing debate. "Silence!" the Overseer snapped, slamming a scaled fist on the armrest. The noise died instantly. Walker continued as though nothing had happened. "I get it. You thought cutting us off would bring us to our knees. Makes sense, really. Most civilizations depend on centralized trade, so an embargo like this would be a death sentence." He took a slow sip from his coffee cup. "Thing is, We don't operate like most civilizations. The overseer's jaws clenched. Walker gestured toward a smaller screen on his desk. See, we've been building redundancies into our supply chain for decades. The moment you imposed those tariffs last cycle, we got to work. New trade partners, independent resource networks, automated logistical hubs. Oh, and those third-party brokerages popping up everywhere. That's cute. You should see the real numbers. You're trying to starve us out, but the only ones hurting are you. The Federation's finance minister, an insectoid with glistening chitin, twitched his mandibles. He's lying. Their economy is too small to sustain such... A new report flashed across the display, cutting him off. Federation-aligned planets were already bypassing the embargo, sourcing Earth-based materials through neutral systems. The Overseer's scales darkened further. Walker glanced at his heads-up display, scrolling through a new message. Oh, almost forgot. We had some fun this morning. Turns out one of your banks wasn't as secure as it claimed. A security alert flashed across the Grand Vault's displays. The largest credit hub in the sector had been hit with a liquidity crisis. The embargo had caused a minor panic, leading to mass withdrawals. Some financial institutions had collapsed overnight, not on Earth, but within the Federation's own trade routes. The Overseer shot to his feet, his expression unreadable. This is an act of economic warfare, Walker arched a brow. Is it? He leaned back in his chair. You fired first, remember? The display cut out, leaving only the financial reports behind. The chamber sank into silence. A Federation warship, its hull gleaming under a system's twin suns, blocked the path of an Earth-marked freighter. The alien captain activated the comms. You are in violation of the embargo, he declared, his voice laced with artificial authority. Stand down and prepare to be boarded. The freighter's response was instant, but not what the captain expected. Thank you for contacting Terra Unlimited Logistics. Your call is very important to us. Please hold. Hold music began playing. The bridge crew fell into stunned silence. The captain's mandibles clicked once, confused. He turned to his weapons officer. Shut down their engines. We can't, sir. The captain's gaze snapped toward him. What? The weapons officer gestured toward his console where a new firewall had appeared, blocking the Federation's override codes. This isn't possible, the captain muttered. The freighter continued on its way, undisturbed. At a private UN meeting, Walker stood at the center of a quiet conference room, watching as global trade figures held steady. Behind him, on the laser plasma display, the Federation's economy flickered like a system on the edge of failure. The trade secretary exhaled through his nose, watching the data with a detached expression. They thought they could break us, he murmured. They thought wrong, Walker replied. The room remained silent for a moment longer, the weight of reality settling over them. The Federation had started this war. They just hadn't realized they were the ones losing it. The Overseer stood alone, his aides retreating to the shadows, his hands curled into fists, his mind racing. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Earth was supposed to be scrambling for survival. Instead, they were watching the Federation crumble from the inside. A new warning flashed on the display. The largest trade syndicates were preparing to abandon the Federation's control. The galaxy's markets were shifting, and Earth wasn't just surviving the embargo. It was thriving in its absence. The Overseer's breath quickened. The power dynamic had flipped, and for the first time in centuries, the Federation was no longer the galaxy's economic heart. A single message pinged onto the main screen. New trade directive issued by Earth's commerce sector. We're open for business, with everyone but you. The Overseer's vision blurred, rage tightening in his chest. Earth had won the first round, and they hadn't even needed to fire a shot. The Grand Vault was in chaos. The Trade Overseer stood before the chamber's laser plasma display. his fists clenched as fresh reports flooded in. A slow, steady bleed of wealth, a draining Federation economy. The collapse wasn't a sudden implosion, it was a silent, relentless suffocation. The embargo had backfired. Earth hadn't just survived, it had expanded. The Overseer's 4 lower arms tapped against the console, betraying his unease. Behind him, his advisors spoke in hushed tones, trying to salvage explanations. "Neutral brokers are circumventing restrictions," an aide muttered. "The smuggling routes. We can't track them fast enough." "The embargoes are feeding a black market empire instead of crippling them," another said. The Overseer turned sharply, his scaled jaw tightening. "Then shut it down." An uneasy pause. "We've tried," the chief economic officer admitted. "The network is too decentralized. Even if we seize one operation, 2 more replace it." The Overseer's tail lashed, a sharp crack against the marble floor. "We control trade across entire star systems. How is this possible?" A different voice answered, low and deliberate. "Because Earth doesn't need us." The council chamber turned as one. At the edge of the dais, Trade Director Vos Varn, a member of the Ordesh banking syndicate, watched the screens with narrowed eyes. His voice was calm, but his tone carried something cold, an understanding of power shifting in real time. "They prepared for this, Overseer," Vos Varn continued. "We thought we were isolating them, but they had contingencies in place." He gestured to the screens. "And now, we're watching them undermine our economy without firing a shot." The Overseer's hands curled into fists. "No," he growled. "They're criminals, smugglers, parasites leeching off the Galactic Order." Vos Varn tilted his head, his tone unshaken. "Then tell me, Overseer, if they're parasites, why are we the ones bleeding?" A cargo hauler coasted through the black, its registry listed under a neutral colony. Inside the cramped cockpit, Captain Royce Lorne, an independent trader, scanned his heads-up display. Incoming transmission. He tapped the control panel, and a crisp voice came through. "Delivery confirmed. Route is green. Proceed as planned." Lorne smirked. Easy money. The Federation thought they had blocked Earth's supply lines. What they hadn't considered? There were no Earth supply lines. Not officially, anyway. A new shadow network had formed. Unregistered freighters, neutral world traders, automated delivery systems Earth had never publicized. Every route was fluid, constantly shifting. The moment the Federation locked one down, 2 others appeared. Lorne glanced at his co-pilot, a silent nod passing between them. Time to work. With a flick of his controls, the hauler's external ID shifted, displaying a different registry code. By the time the Federation's patrol ships scanned them, they would appear as a harmless agricultural supplier, one of hundreds drifting through space unnoticed. A chime from the navigation display signaled clearance. The Federation's embargo was still active, but Earth's trade never stopped moving. A Federation patrol commander stood rigid, his 4 yellowed eyes narrowing as he scanned the incoming cargo logs. This was impossible. They had triple-checked trade lanes, increased patrols, enacted automated customs screenings, and yet the numbers weren't changing. Earth's trade volume hadn't dropped. If anything, it had increased. A junior officer hesitated before speaking. "Sir, the new screening protocols, they're not catching anything." The commander's throat tightened. The Federation's bureaucratic systems weren't built for this. They functioned on established laws, predictable routes, registered traders. The moment Earth had gone off the grid, those systems had become useless. The junior officer swallowed hard. "Sir, should we request additional fleet support?" The commander's jaw tensed. Sending in more ships meant admitting the embargo wasn't working. It meant the Federation's authority wasn't absolute, and the Overseer would not tolerate that answer. "Hold your position," the commander ordered. "We will find their weak point." He turned back to the plasma display, eyes scanning for an answer that wasn't there. The Federation's banking representatives sat in silence. For centuries, the Galactic Trade Federation had been the unchallenged center of commerce. Their economic policies dictated entire civilizations. Their embargoes broke empires. Yet here they sat, watching Earth make a mockery of them. A transmission flashed on the Overseer's personal display, a defection request. One of their mid-tier banking syndicates was officially withdrawing from the Federation's economic oversight. The Overseer's chest tightened. More followed. Trade cartels, independent financiers, mercantile alliances. One after another, they cut ties, redirecting investments, dissolving old contracts, forming new alliances. The Overseer gritted his teeth. This wasn't just a trade dispute anymore. This was the beginning of a power shift. James Walker stood at the edge of the UN Trade Office, watching the shifting data across the heads-up display. The Federation was folding in on itself. The embargo had become its own worst enemy. He exhaled, adjusting his glasses. A transmission request flashed onto his personal screen. Encrypted. Unregistered origin. He answered. A low, deliberate voice came through. "We're ready to talk." Walker smirked. The first Federation defectors had just come to negotiate. They wouldn't be the last. The Overseer's hands trembled as another withdrawal report flashed onto the plasma display. He turned to his aides, his voice low and tight. "Summon the Emergency Council." His staff hesitated. "But, Overseer, now!" They scrambled to obey. The Federation's might had never been questioned before. Their embargoes had always crushed their enemies. Yet Earth had shrugged them off, untouched. This wasn't just an economic war anymore. The Federation was now fighting for its very survival. And the worst part? They were already losing. The Grand Vault's war chamber pulsed with shifting data. The laser plasma displays projected one brutal fact after another: trade losses, economic fractures, planetary defections. The room, once a bastion of galactic commerce, now carried the scent of desperation. The Trade Overseer stood motionless, his scaled hands pressed against the control panel, his mind reeling. "How many?" he asked. A junior analyst hesitated before answering. 17 syndicates have officially severed ties, Overseer." A ripple of tension passed through the room. The Federation had lost entire economic sectors overnight. Their stranglehold on trade had shattered, not through war, but through quiet, relentless attrition. A new report flashed onto the plasma display. A faction of independent merchants had switched allegiance to Earth. The Overseer's jaw tightened. This wasn't just a failing embargo. This was a collapse in real time. He turned to Trade Director Vosvarn, the cold strategist who had seen this unraveling before anyone else. "Tell me you have a countermeasure," the Overseer demanded. Vosvarn didn't look away from the screen. "We have a response." James Walker stood in the UN's strategic briefing room, his gaze fixed on the heads-up display. The Federation's latest maneuver was unfolding before them. A block of Earth-affiliated credit lines had been frozen. Their assets, once untouchable, were suddenly locked in bureaucratic limbo. A bold move. A desperate one. Across the room, financial strategists worked in quiet urgency. This was the Federation's first direct counterattack, a last-ditch effort to choke Earth's financial arteries before they lost complete control. Walker exhaled, adjusting his glasses. "Right on schedule," he murmured. The Trade Secretary, a seasoned negotiator with a calm demeanor, sipped his coffee, watching the economic warfare unfold. "They're trying to stall us," he said. "Slow down the momentum." Walker nodded. "That means they know they've lost." The Trade Secretary swiped across his control panel, bringing up a secondary trade network map. "We already predicted this response," he said. "We just didn't think they'd be dumb enough to try it." Walker turned to his team. Activate contingency plans. Unleash the counterfeit flood. The room moved at once. Aboard the Galactic Trade Authority's central banking hub, a financial officer scanned the incoming transactions. Everything looked normal. Then the alert started flashing. Unauthorized credit transfers, duplicate transactions looping through the Federation's most secure servers. The officer's throat went dry. What is this? His supervisor leaned over his console, confusion turning into horror. A wave of counterfeit digital currency had been injected into the market. Too subtle to detect immediately, but spreading like a virus. Their system was drowning in fraudulent transactions, and by the time they purged them, it would be too late. The overseer's claws dug into the marble railing, his breath tight. "Report!" A financial minister turned sharply, his expression uncharacteristically pale. "They crashed our digital credit verification system." The overseer's vision blurred for a fraction of a second. Impossible. How? They rerouted credit transactions through neutral third parties, flooded the system with counterfeit orders, then pulled the real funds before the system could flag them. "They're bleeding us dry, overseer." The room fell deathly silent. For centuries, the Galactic Trade Federation had dictated the financial structure of the galaxy. Their economy was supposed to be unshakable. And yet, here it was, faltering. "Restore control, now." Vosvarn finally turned from the display. "Overseer," he said, voice steady, measured. "We are not dealing with amateurs." The overseer's fingers twitched. "They want us to panic," Vosvarn continued. "If we do, we accelerate their victory." The overseer's eyes burned. "Then what do you suggest?" Vosvarn's gaze darkened. "We starve them out." A message arrived at Walker's terminal, a direct relay from a Federation-controlled financial hub. The Federation was launching its next play. They had shut down trade lanes to Earth's closest allies, cutting them off from supply shipments, freezing joint trade agreements. Walker adjusted his tie. Did they just sanction their own trade partners? The trade secretary chuckled, shaking his head. "They're self-destructing in real time." Walker turned back to his team. "Shift cargo routes," he ordered. "Send shipments through fringe world markets. Let's see how long they last without their own supply lines." A staffer smirked. "Should we send them a thank you card?" Walker grinned. "Let's wait until they beg first." A fleet of Federation warships patrolled the blockade zone, their commanders confident. The embargo had been reinforced. No unauthorized cargo would pass through this sector. They had trapped Earth. Finally. Then the freighters started arriving. One by one, they entered the blockade zone. Not through Federation-controlled checkpoints, but through uncharted gravitational corridors, pathways the Federation had never mapped. The blockade was a joke, and the warships, they were guarding an empty sector. The overseer's breathing grew shallow as the latest report flashed across the heads-up display. Earth's supply chain had rerouted completely. The blockade had failed. The counterfeit currency was still disrupting markets. And now, Federation-aligned worlds were starting to riot. The walls of power were cracking. The overseer staggered back, his mind spinning. "Impossible!" Vosvarn's voice was steady, final. "Overseer." The overseer turned. Vosvarn's golden eyes narrowed. "It's time to accept the reality before us." The overseer's throat tightened, and for the first time, he felt the weight of inevitable defeat. Walker watched the final economic collapse report scrolling across his screen. The Federation had fought desperately, but they had never stood a chance. The blockade had crumbled, the embargo had collapsed, and now, Earth held the economic power of the galaxy in its hands. The trade secretary leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "What now?" Walker smiled, but his voice was cold. "Now, we make sure they never try this again." The Grand Vault's war chamber was no longer the heart of galactic commerce. It had become a crisis center, the air thick with strained silence. The trade overseer sat motionless, eyes locked onto the laser plasma display, where a fresh wave of economic collapse reports flickered like a death toll. The blockade had failed. The sanctions had collapsed. And now, their own allies were turning against them. Vosvarn stood nearby, his golden eyes tracking the data with a calculating gaze. "We are no longer containing an economic insurgency," he said, his voice even. "We are witnessing the end of the Federation's trade dominance." The overseer's fingers curled against the console, his claws scraping against the surface. "This isn't over," he growled. Vosvarn tilted his head slightly, considering the claim. "Then tell me, Overseer," he said, "what do we have left?" In the UN's Strategic Operations Room, James Walker watched the heads-up display, a quiet satisfaction settling over him. The Federation had pushed back. Now, Earth would end it. The Trade Secretary adjusted his tie, scrolling through the latest reports. "They're trying to stall their own collapse," he said. "Rerouting finances, calling in old favors." Walker took a slow breath, eyes never leaving the display. Too late for that. A new transmission blinked onto the screen. One of the Federation's banking sectors had gone dark. Not from war, not from sabotage, from internal defection. The Federation's own financial leaders were abandoning ship. Walker smirked. "They killed themselves the moment they tried to kill us." The Trade Secretary nodded. "Time to finish this?" Walker didn't hesitate. "Pull the trigger." Aboard the Galactic Trade Authority's primary banking hub, chaos erupted. A financial officer's hands trembled over his console as entire planetary economies vanished from their systems. "Sector 5 just defaulted," he whispered. A second voice, shaken. "Sector 8 is burning through emergency reserves. They have hours left." A third, almost breathless. "Sir, we just lost an entire trade fleet, auctioned off to private buyers." The Federation wasn't just losing power. It was being sold for scraps. The banking hub's director pressed his hands against his temples, his breathing shallow. "Where's our countermeasure?" A tech officer checked the feeds, their expression blank. "There isn't one." The director's chest tightened. They had built a system so powerful it had never needed a failsafe. Until now. The overseer's claws tapped against the marble railing, his eyes moving from one failing trade route to the next. The heads-up display showed the same truth from every angle. They had lost. Federation-controlled planets were breaking away, aligning with neutral systems. Earth had become the new economic center, not by conquest, not by force, by efficiency, by resilience, by playing the game better than the ones who had created it. The overseer swallowed hard. How did this happen?" Vosvarn exhaled slowly, folding his hands behind his back. "They evolved." The Grand Vault's emergency alarm blared, signaling the unthinkable. A formal dissolution request had been filed. The Galactic Trade Federation was crumbling from the inside. The overseer closed his eyes. The war was over, and the Federation had lost. Walker set his coffee down, watching the final report scroll across the screen. The Federation's entire leadership had been thrown into turmoil. Their economy was in irreversible freefall. Their corporate elite were abandoning ship. Earth hadn't just survived. It had become the new center of galactic commerce. The Trade Secretary leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. And just like that, they're done. Walker's expression remained unreadable. They did it to themselves. A soft chime from the plasma display. A new transmission. The Federation's surviving leadership was reaching out. Walker let the silence stretch for a moment. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he answered. The overseer's face appeared, his usual arrogance fractured, his shoulders tense. Behind him, the Grand Vault's chamber was in shambles, officials scrambling, trade syndicates shouting over one another. "Walker," the overseer said, voice tight. Walker adjusted his glasses. "You look stressed." The overseer's jaw clenched. We need to talk." Walker's smirk was barely there. "Funny," he said. "I don't recall needing you for anything." The overseer inhaled sharply, his pride at war with reality. He hated this. Hated that Earth had won. But he had no other choice. "You want peace?" the overseer asked, voice low. Walker leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. "Peace," he echoed. No, you misunderstood." The overseer stiffened. Walker let the moment stretch, then delivered the final blow. "We're here to negotiate your surrender." The transmission cut out. The Federation's last shred of authority was gone. Walker exhaled, watching the screen fade to black. The Grand Vault's council chamber was barely functional. What had once been a temple of commerce, a sanctum where galactic trade laws were dictated, now sat in disarray. The laser plasma displays no longer projected the controlled stability of the Federation's economic empire. Instead, they flickered with reports of collapse, markets in freefall, supply chains fractured, trade routes overrun by independent operators. At the center of it all, the trade overseer sat stiffly, his claws gripping the armrests of his elevated throne-like chair. The power he had wielded for centuries was gone. The Grand Vault's doors slid open with a smooth hiss. James Walker entered. He took his time. His shoes tapped against the polished marble, the sound unnervingly casual against the tension suffocating the room. He didn't need guards. He didn't need an entourage. He walked in alone, because Earth didn't need to prove its dominance. The overseer's gaze flicked upward, locking onto Walker's. There was no arrogance left in those alien eyes, only the bitter weight of inevitability. Walker adjusted his tie, surveying the room. The once proud council members sat hunched, some avoiding his gaze, others watching him with barely concealed resentment. Walker exhaled, then folded his hands behind his back. "So," he said, his voice calm, measured. "How are we feeling today?" The silence was suffocating. Vosvarn, the only trade director who hadn't fled or resigned, broke it first. "We acknowledge Earth's victory," he said. His tone was even, but Walker could hear the unspoken weight behind it. Walker smiled slightly. "Good, then we can get to business." He walked toward the central negotiation table, taking the seat across from the overseer. The alien's hands twitched slightly. "What are your terms?" Walker didn't rush his answer. He adjusted his heads-up display, scanning through the latest Federation collapse reports. Then he looked up. "You surrender," he said simply. The overseer flinched but said nothing. Walker continued. "The Galactic Trade Federation is finished, but the galaxy still needs structure, trade still needs order, so here's how this works." He leaned forward slightly. "You will dismantle the Federation's authority over the galactic economy." His voice remained calm, steady. "No more tariffs, no more sanctions, no more monopolies." He let the words settle. The overseer swallowed hard. "And in return?" Walker's expression didn't change. "In return, we don't completely erase your financial institutions from existence." A sharp, collective inhale rippled through the council. Walker let the silence hang in the air, then he tilted his head slightly. "Oh, and one more thing." The overseer's voice was hoarse. "What?" Walker's gaze sharpened. "You're going to tell the galaxy what really happened." The overseer's jaw clenched. Walker tapped the console in front of him, activating the room's main plasma display. A live transmission request appeared. "This isn't just about you," Walker said, voice edged with quiet finality. "This is about every system that was forced to live under your rules. Every world that was told it had to bow to your authority or starve. The overseer stared at the screen. Walker leaned back slightly. They deserve to hear it from you. The overseer's claws dug into the table, his throat tight, but he nodded, because he had no other choice. Across the galaxy, on every trade world, every neutral colony, every independent station, the broadcast cut through all standard transmissions. The image of the overseer appeared, his once imposing figure now burdened with defeat. He exhaled slowly, then spoke. The Galactic Trade Federation surrenders. A ripple of shock and exhilaration spread through the galaxy. Every smuggler, trader, independent merchant, planetary leader who had ever suffered under the Federation's control sat frozen, watching history unfold. The Federation's embargo has failed, the overseer continued. We acknowledge Earth's victory. We acknowledge their right to dictate new economic terms. The words cut deep, but they had to be said, and with them, centuries of unchecked power crumbled. Inside the UN's Strategic Operations Center, Walker watched the broadcast, a slow exhale leaving his lips. The Trade Secretary smirked, shaking his head. I never thought I'd see the day. Walker nodded. It took them long enough. The transmission concluded, and across the room, economic analysts scrambled to confirm the final figures. The last holdout banks are folding, one reported. Trade syndicates are restructuring under Earth's new agreements, another added. Walker nodded, his expression unreadable. The war wasn't won with guns. It was won with strategy, patience, and leverage. The Federation had tried to crush Earth. Instead, they had handed Earth control of the galaxy's trade, and not a single shot had been fired. The overseer sat in silence, staring at the blackened display where the transmission had ended. The Federation was dead. Their economic empire was over. And Earth? Earth was now the new center of galactic trade. Vosvarn stood at his side, watching him carefully. You did what had to be done. The overseer closed his eyes. Number, he had done what Earth forced him to do. Walker stood on the balcony of the UN Trade Headquarters, watching as the city below hummed with life. A new transmission request flickered onto his personal heads-up display. An allied trade syndicate wanted a meeting. Walker smirked. The galaxy was finally playing by Earth's rules. And the Federation? Just another historical footnote. The UN Trade Headquarters was alive with motion. Inside the command center, screens flickered with the latest economic shifts. Former Federation-controlled markets reorganizing, trade syndicates aligning under new regulations, independent worlds solidifying their ties with Earth. James Walker sat at the center of it all, arms crossed, watching the data unfold across the heads-up display. The Federation was finished. Now came the real work, rebuilding the galaxy's economic structure in a way that ensured no empire could ever monopolize power again. A message request flashed across the display. Encrypted. High priority. Walker accepted it. The holographic seal of the Ordesh banking syndicate appeared. A familiar voice followed. Vosvarn. The chamber that had once dictated galactic trade law was silent. Vosvarn stood in the now abandoned council hall, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the laser plasma display in front of him. The Galactic Trade Federation was dead, but commerce didn't stop, and where there was money, there was power. Walker's image flickered to life on the display. Vosvarn, Walker greeted, adjusting his glasses. Didn't take you long to clean house. The Ordesh banker's golden eyes narrowed. Survival demands adaptation, he replied smoothly. I assume you're here to dictate the next step? Walker leaned forward slightly. Dictate? Number. But let's not pretend this is a negotiation. Vosvarn exhaled slowly. You want my syndicate to ensure stability. Make sure the economy doesn't collapse during the transition. Walker nodded. Exactly. At what cost? Walker's smirk was barely visible. At the cost of never allowing another federation to rise again. Vosvarn's gaze darkened. He had built his wealth within the system, but he wasn't blind. The Federation's fall had created a power vacuum. Earth had the strength to seize it, yet instead, Walker was doing something far more dangerous. He was rebuilding the rules entirely. Vosvarn exhaled. So, Earth is taking control. Walker shook his head. Not control. Oversight. He leaned forward. We don't want a throne, Vosvarn. We want a network. One that's impossible to strangle, impossible to monopolize. One that doesn't let people like the Overseer decide who lives and who starves. Vosvarn considered him for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. I can work with that. The transmission cut. Walker leaned back. The next phase had begun. The economic transition was seamless. Independent planets that had once feared financial ruin now thrived under Earth's decentralized trade model. No central power, no single controlling force. Earth had proven a point. No civilization should hold absolute economic dominance. The Trade Secretary scanned the latest reports, shaking his head. They still don't get it. Walker glanced at him. Who? The former Federation elites, the Secretary replied. They keep waiting for someone to replace them. They don't understand no one is coming. Walker smirked. That's the point. But not everyone accepted the new order. Aboard a hidden station in the outrim sectors, remnants of the Federation's ruling elite gathered. Former financial ministers, corporate executives, trade enforcers, all of them clinging to a system that no longer existed. The room was dimly lit, their voices hushed. We should have fought back harder, one muttered. The galaxy needs leadership, another insisted. It needs structure. Without the Federation... The doors slid open. A figure entered. The Overseer. No longer commanding. No longer respected. Just a relic of a bygone era. Enough, he growled. His claws flexed, but there was no force behind it anymore. We don't need to rebuild the Federation, he said. We need to destroy what replaced it. Murmurs spread through the room. If we strike Earth's trade networks, if we destabilize their systems, if we make the galaxy realize that without centralized control, everything falls apart. The plot was forming. The last remnants of the Federation were about to make their final move. Walker set his coffee down, watching as a fresh report flashed across his heads-up display. The Federation loyalists were making moves. The Trade Secretary glanced at the data. Looks like they're not done losing yet. Walker adjusted his tie. They think they can start a counterstrike. The Secretary raised a brow. Can they? Walker's smile was cold. They can try. He stood, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the command center. Let's remind them why they lost the first time. The UN Trade Command Center was quiet. Not the silence of inactivity, the silence before a storm. James Walker sat at the center of it all, one hand resting on the heads-up display, the other adjusting his glasses. The screen flickered with the latest intelligence reports. The Federation loyalists were moving. A coordinated cyber assault on Earth's decentralized trade network, their last desperate attempt to undo what they had lost. Walker exhaled. They still think we're playing the same game. The Trade Secretary stood nearby, scanning the reports. They assume if they break the system, the galaxy will come crawling back to them. Walker tapped his fingers against the console, thinking. They don't realize there is no system anymore, he murmured. The Trade Secretary smirked. So, how do we handle this? Walker's gaze hardened. We let them play their hand, and then we erase them. Deep within the outrim sectors, aboard an abandoned Federation station, the last remnants of the old order gathered. The overseer stood at the head of the war table, watching as his last loyalists finalized the attack sequence. "The galaxy is in chaos without us," one of his advisors insisted. The overseer nodded. "We make them realize their mistake." He turned to the lead technician. "Launch the virus. Corrupt Earth's trade infrastructure. Make their networks collapse." The technician hesitated. "Sir, if we do this, we risk—" "Do it!" The command was given. Lines of code infiltrated Earth's systems, weaving through the digital architecture of its new trade empire. A slow smile spread across the overseer's face. "We take everything from them." Then his display flickered. The virus had activated, and nothing happened. Silence. Confused glances spread through the room. "Why isn't it working?" one of the technicians whispered. The overseer's claws clenched. "What's wrong?" A calm voice echoed through the chamber's speakers. "Walker." "That was cute," Walker's voice said, his tone almost amused. The overseer's blood ran cold. Walker's face appeared on the main laser plasma display, eyes gleaming behind his glasses. "You thought you could crash Earth's trade networks?" he said, leaning slightly forward. "That's the problem with you Federation types. You never learn to adapt." The overseer's throat tightened. "You knew," Walker smiled. "We let you in." The loyalists stared in horror. Walker wasn't blocking their virus. He was rerouting it. The virus didn't collapse Earth's networks. It infected the loyalists' remaining assets instead. The overseer turned back to his display. His accounts were being drained, his hidden assets seized, his warships, his supply caches all compromised. Walker's voice remained calm. "You lost your trade empire, overseer. Then you lost your war. And now, you just handed us the last of your resources." The overseer's claws dug into the console, his breathing sharp. "We can rebuild." "No," Walker said, voice turning sharp. "You can't." The plasma display shifted, revealing the final screen, the station's coordinates, transmitted to everyone. Galactic bounty hunters, private security firms, governments who wanted revenge on the Federation's old enforcers. Walker leaned back in his chair. "I'd start running if I were you." The display went dark. A sharp, piercing alarm filled the hideout. Incoming ships, dozens. The overseer's chest tightened. Walker had done more than erase the last of their power. He had put a bounty on their heads. The overseer turned to his men. "Get to the ships, now!" Walker watched the final reports roll in across the heads-up display. The Federation loyalists were on the run, hunted by the very galaxy they had once ruled. The Trade Secretary exhaled, shaking his head. "That's it, then." Walker nodded. "No more Federation. No more loyalists." He stood, adjusting his jacket. "Just a galaxy that's finally free to make its own decisions." The Trade Secretary chuckled. "So what happens now? We take the throne?" Walker smirked. "There is no throne." He turned toward the massive viewport overlooking Earth's capital. "We don't need a seat at the top," he said. "We are the foundation now." A new trade request flashed across the system, an independent planet reaching out. Walker accepted the request. The galaxy's new economy was already moving forward. And Earth? It wasn't ruling, it was leading. The Grand Vault sat empty, the weight of its history erased in days. The council chamber, once filled with trade moguls and economic warlords, was silent. No more tariffs, no more monopolies, just a cold reminder that the Federation's reign had ended. A new galaxy had risen, and Earth had built it. The Federation declared war on Earth. Earth hardly cared. Now, Earth owned the game, and the galaxy would never forget it.